plenary session, Age of Agglomerations, Strategy of Russia, is to begin in 1 minute.
Как устроена планета людей? Представим, что
How does the planet of people work? Let's imagine that 1 pixel is 100,000 people. Then this is the 7 billion strong mankind. More than half of the Earth's population live in cities. All cities are different, but 300 biggest agglomerations have 20% of global population. Their ability to attract talent is truly amazing. This 1/5 of mankind generates almost half of global GDP. How does this work? Every bubble is an agglomeration, and its size matches its population. Here are the 5 biggest agglomerations of the world. Their combined population is comparable to the population of Russia. 10 biggest agglomeration would equal Indonesia. The top 10 of the world's agglomeration have 40 times more people living them than in the bottom 10. 37 million people live in Tokyo. This is 68 times bigger than Darim with 500,000. But population is not the only success factor. We should add its economic weight to each agglomeration. This is a physics/economic model of 300 biggest agglomerations in the world. Here you can see each of the agglomerations. The size of each agglomeration is determined by how appealing it is to human and financial capital. You can see that smaller agglomerations are often much more successful than the ones that are more populated. Jakarta and Tokyo have almost equal number of people living in them, but Tokyo is 20 times as rich. Now let's place all these bubbles on the physical map of the Earth. This is the planet of agglomerations. It is a planet that swiftly moves from the concentration of resources to hyper-concentration. This is the current power rankings of the champion agglomerations World League. 3 largest agglomerations generate 4% of global GDP. That is comparable to countries like Germany and Russia. The aggregate economic weight of the top 10 of agglomerations is only second to US and China, and well ahead of Japan. The 21st century is a time when Asian mega-cities have been growing very quickly. Out of 50 most populated agglomerations, 34 are in Asia, 6 in Latin America, and 6 in Europe. But if you look at the wealth, you will see a completely different picture. Among 50 most successful agglomerations, almost half are in Northern America. Welcome to Moscow, one of the most quickly growing agglomerations in the world. Moscow is currently ranked 10th in the world in terms of its economy. It contributes to the global GDP more than countries like Belgium, Switzerland, Chile, or Vietnam. Moscow's economy is more than Mumbai, Cairo, Kolkata, Manila, and Chennai taken together, and these cities have 70 million people living in them. Together with London and Paris, Moscow is the big three of European agglomerations. Moscow Urban Forum 2017 is a congress about the biggest cities and how they change our planet today. Dear guests and participants of the Moscow Urban Forum 2017, we start our opening plenary session of Day 2, the Age of Agglomerations, Russia's Strategy. Our moderator this morning is the head of New Economic Growth, Mikhail Dmitriev. Dear guests and participants of the forum, yesterday at the opening plenary session, we talked about managing agglomeration growth. Today our subject will be slightly different. We'll talk about agglomerations and how they affect the development of their countries, how they affect the global economy in general. Economists and politicians have evolved in their concept over the past 10 years on this matter. Of course, 15 years ago, everybody realized how important it is to concentrate resources in big cities and the effect this can have on economic growth, potentially. But back then, to be honest with you, politicians who formulate the agenda for their country's development, agglomerations were on the periphery of their attention. When we worked on Russia's Strategy 2020, we had basically next to nothing in a strategy on urban development. Yes, we talked about delineating responsibilities between regions and cities, but we were not talking about agglomeration development back then. Our first step in this direction in Russia was a World Bank report in 2009 on new economic geography. In this report, for the first time ever, we saw how important is the role of agglomerations for the whole world and Russia specifically. And the next important step was a report by McKinsey, a report they prepared in 2011. This report displayed some astounding figures even back then. 600 biggest agglomerations of the world generated about 50% of global GDP. Frankly, before McKinsey announced this figure, few people around the world were aware of that. And actually, McKinsey said that by 2025, it will be 65% of global GDP, not just 50. These major studies helped us to shift the focus of national and international politicians towards agglomerations. And today, people no longer think about agglomerations as a local issue, a regional issue. They're regarded as part of the national agenda. Today, at this forum, we're witnessing an event that illustrates the fact that agglomerations are now a prominent part of the national agenda, Russia included. So once again, we should compare our notes and consider where we are. Right now, I would like to welcome to this stage Global Managing Director of McKinsey & Company, who I think was directly involved in working on this report released 6 years ago. And I would ask Dominic Barton to tell us if anything has changed over the past 6 years. First of all, maybe we can see New Horizon today. Maybe we should talk about 2030 instead of 2025. What will happen by year 2030? What will the big picture look like in terms of agglomerations? And maybe there are new challenges emerging that will somehow interfere with the prospects of this growth of agglomerations and their growing role in global development. So, Dominic, please welcome to the stage.
Thank you very much. It's wonderful to be here. Thank you, Mikhail. I can think of actually no better place to talk about the importance of cities than Moscow, and a special call out to the mayor for the leadership that you've shown, because I've had the chance to visit Moscow for the last 25 years. And it is to say that the changes here have been extraordinary is an understatement of what's happening. What I wanted to do is just give a bit of an overview. Mikhail, it's going to reinforce some of the themes that we've talked about, the importance of cities and agglomerations for the world, for growth. So let me just start by stepping back, and forgive me for putting this in English, but there are basically 4 big mega forces that are out there in the world today that all of us need to think about. We have an economic power shift, which is moving towards Asia and Africa over the next 30 years, the scale of which we've never seen in our history before as humans, the scale of that shift. We've got a massive technological change that's going on. We have a rapidly aging world, and we have a frustrated world, people looking everywhere for a new societal deal. So this is a time of immense change, and agglomerations and cities are where it's going to either happen or not as we look ahead. If you think about urbanization, we've basically been a rural world for most of our history. It's only in the last 50 years that we've seen a shift. And what we're going to see basically by 2030 is 60% of humans will be in cities. This is where gravity is moving to. And urbanization, I would argue, is one of the biggest drivers of GDP growth. One of the reasons why I feel confident about Chinese growth over the next 10 to 15 years is because China is only 56% urbanized. It's still moving on that system. And when you move people from the rural areas to the cities, you typically get productivity growth as you see it. There'll be roughly 2.4 billion people moving in the system. That's just, again, a scale that we have never seen before in our history. And that's why I think we need to learn from those cities that are able to make it work versus those that are not. I like to just take pictures of this. This is a picture of Pudong, which is the new district of Shanghai. That is a picture of it sort of 25 years later. The speed with which cities are being built is phenomenal. This is what Shenzhen looked like in 1980. That's what it looked like 30 years later in terms of the shift. So we see this as well in the Middle East. Abu Dhabi in 1970, Abu Dhabi in 2016. Just a dramatic change. And that's happening in 200 cities today in the world. But for most of us, especially those of us from North America, we have no clue about them, but they are going to be the most important cities for us as we look ahead. The infrastructure requirements are massive. We think that about $3.7 trillion in infrastructure needs to be spent on an annual basis over the next 20 years, basically. A phenomenal amount to be built properly in making this work. When we think, for example, about China, much like the presentation, the video that was shown before, I don't look at China as China. I think about it as 22 clusters of cities. That's what it looks like. And the differences in behaviors, in consumer behaviors, and how people feel about their government and how they work is very different across those 22 clusters of cities. There are more in common between parts of Vietnam, the Hanoi, Ho Chi Minh clusters, and some of these cities than there are between the cities within the country. That's what's actually happening and changing. The changes in technology that we need to think about are very significant. We think there are at least 13 technologies that are disrupting us. We think we're in chapter 1 of a 100-chapter book of these changes. We know about the mobile internet, we know about automation, but when you think about robotics, you think about energy storage, 3D printing, blockchain, it's going to fundamentally change how we work and how we live over time. And again, cities are where that's going to happen or not over time. Automation, I think, is going to be one of the most significant issues that we as humans are going to have to deal with over the next 10 to 15 years. If you think about today, for 60% of jobs, 30% of what we do can be automated. In a country like Canada, 40% of the jobs that exist today can be and likely will be automated in the next 10 years, right? So we think about globalization causing job displacement. Wait till we see what technology does. And again, I'm an optimist. I like technology, but we need to think about how we're going to reskill people to be able to participate in this new world. And it's cities that are going to make that happen or not. How cities and the universities and the education system improve how we skill that are going to ensure that we have a stable system or not over time. Aging is a very significant issue. We're going to have a doubling of the people over the age of 65. As I like to say, as I get older, I think it's okay that we have more older people, but older people cost more money because most of our healthcare costs are done toward the end of our life. And if we continue to do healthcare like we've been doing it in the past 20 years, as we age, we're going to be in serious trouble. And I think what Moscow has done in rethinking how to do healthcare in a clinical, with the clinics that they've set up, breaking out the administration from the doctors, and the speed with which it's done, I think is something that we should all be looking at around the world, because we need to radically improve how we've done it. And so I think this is one of the many areas where Moscow is a lighthouse. But we're going to need to do more, because as we get older, the cost and issues around health are going to be important. The other thing I just wanted to say about these agglomerations and cities, and we don't talk about this enough, is the importance of leadership. You need, it's one thing to have all the ingredients, to talk about technology, to talk about the people that you have, but at the end of the day, you need the leadership. And I just show this example up here, which basically is 2 US cities which were very, very similar to each other in 2000 on all dimensions. The size, and if you did some sort of a measure of well-being, they were similar. But over basically a 15 to 20 year period, you saw a divergence in terms of the performance. And this is leadership. So many cities may have the ingredients, but if you don't have the leadership, you don't have the mayors and the leadership team around the mayor to drive it, you're going to see very different performance. And Austin far outperforms where Memphis is. And as the mayor has explained here, but we've also seen in the charts, once you start getting something moving, there's a gravitational effect. You get scale and it accelerates. So I think we can never underestimate the importance of leadership and vision in building these systems. Mikhail mentioned the 600 cities database. We have a database of about 2,000 cities. Today, those cities are driving about 60%. It's moving to 65%. What's interesting, though, is there's churn in that group of 600. It isn't a stable group. And many of them now are coming from the new world, right, and where we're moving it. Moscow is in the top 100, is a big driver of where GDP growth is. But it's really cities is how we have to think about GDP growth, not countries, as we look ahead. And the final page I just wanted to put up here is, I think, as this conference shows, there's a lot we can learn from what's going on in different cities. We think there are 5 areas that cities are going to have to focus much more deliberately on. One of these economic centers, what are going to be the engines of growth with all of these technology changes as we look ahead? And we've seen very significant shifts. Boston has gone through a dramatic change to becoming basically a healthcare city. Pittsburgh has in the US from a steel manufacturing city to more of a health city. And thinking deliberately about what industries do we want to try and cluster our universities, our venture capital, and so forth around is very important. And I think, again, we're seeing some very interesting examples here in Moscow. The attracting and retaining of talent. Talent is going to be critical in this knowledge economy with technology. So how easy do you make it for global talent to be able to come into the city? This is going to be a very big problem for the US cities today. San Francisco, Boston, New York, you see the mayors there are very concerned with the view on immigration because that's where a lot of the talent comes from. So those cities that are very good at attracting talent, and often it's through the universities, are the ones that thrive. So thinking about immigration as a lever is important, but also how you develop your people, the education system, given the need for reskilling. The private-public partnership that's required. One of the most inspiring cities I've seen from this is actually Medellin in Colombia. This was the most dangerous city on earth 20 years ago. You would not want to visit. It is now a tourism capital, right? It's one of the most innovative cities in South America. It's got a very high GDP growth. It's now in the list of the 600. And that's because the private sector and the public sector work together to make this work. And then the infrastructure is obviously critical. Congestion. And that's one of the things I would say in Moscow, how much of an improvement there's been just to move people around, using digital to understand what's happening and so forth. So these are 5 areas we think are important to look at. I hope that just gives a bit of an overview of some of the forces that are at work and the importance of cities, and one of the key reasons why we're here in Moscow to learn of what's happened here that we can take to other parts of the world. Thank you very much.
I don't think that we'll have time to ask questions to Dominic and to listen to his answer because he's going to participate in our panel discussion. I would like to proceed with Moscow. Within the panel discussion, there will be a brief presentation made by one of the speakers about the benchmarking of the Moscow agglomeration and other big agglomerations of the world. Moscow agglomeration looks now quite well, following the world criteria for the efficiency of certain agglomerations. And our next speaker, Mr. Sobyanin, will tell us about how he sees the Moscow agglomeration, how it's going to develop in the light of those new global tendencies. I know that Mr. Sobyanin really suffered through his philosophy and German Greff, the nowadays president of Sberbank, told me that when Mr. Sobyanin was vice prime minister, he actually read the report by the World Bank on the new geography, because this is not very common for the vice prime ministers to read too thick volumes because they are too tired of doing that. And I'm sure that actually his stance, his position is very thought out. Thank you so much. And Mr. Sobyanin, the floor goes to you. Michael, when actually I was reading the report of the World Bank, I was not suffering at all because it was very interesting. I was carried out with the text. It was a new revelation of what is going on in the world, what is going on in certain cities, and what global tendencies are there in the modern realities. I'd like to extend my gratitude to everyone who participates actively in our discussions today and yesterday, and speaking about the world tendencies in the area of the agglomerations development. Let me say that we have discussed we are living in the age of the unprecedented growth of megacities. It's been said already that 600 major cities and agglomerations will drive the global economy in general in future. And now I'd like to highlight certain tendencies of the innovative development which is taking place here in Moscow, and certainly I will focus on Moscow, the Moscow agglomeration, and the city of Moscow in general. Urbanization in Russia is going on, as well as in the world, amid all the difficulties, and the last 25 years have become the time of huge success for most of the key cities of Moscow. They have enlarged, they have extended thanks to migration and to the growth in the population. So the population of biggest agglomerations grew by 10 million people, and most of the major cities of Russia managed to build up full-fledged agglomerations. There are more than 20 such agglomerations with a population over 1 million people. The Russian cities have become not only larger, but more convenient and comfortable for living. I mean, they have all the necessary infrastructure, housing, they have been beautified, and so the environment there is absolutely comfortable. The Russian cities have acquired the world-renowned now. Sochi, Kazan, now they are well known around the world. But still, there is some room for improvement. The potential of urbanization for the Russian cities is not exhausted, and this is not only my opinion, but also many experts share it. Soon, big cities and agglomerations will host 8 to 10 million more residents, and most of them are now residing in smaller single-employed cities and rural towns. As a result, in 10 or 15 years, the megacities will have more than 40% of the Russian population. And I think that the migration of people will look like what used to be in Canada and the United States, where most of the people are living in the cities. But at the same time, we should be careful not to lose the most important growth points from Kaliningrad to Vladivostok. We have to create certain gravity centers which would build up some economic growth and the human capital. As has already been said, the Russian cities becoming the global centers of gravity now are participating in the global race. We are competing not for the factories and plants, but rather for talents and human capital. Well-trained and skilled professionals have more opportunities to choose where they want to work, not only within the boundaries of the country, but they may move to any country of the world. And this is typical not only of Russia, but of all other countries of the world. We see people migrating between the cities, and not all the cities may win in that struggle, in that competition. Even such agglomerations, old agglomerations such as the Paris one, for instance, is losing its population, is losing its people because it is surrounded by very powerful competitors or rivals. For Russia, for the Russian cities, I think Moscow is not the main competitor because it takes in only 10 million migrants from within Russia, and huge bulk of the population are moving away from Moscow to other countries of the world. Therefore, the main ambition of Moscow and other cities is to create all the necessary conditions not to lose the skills and talents, to retain the most talented people. A few words about the Moscow agglomeration. It is the biggest not only in Russia, but as has already been said, it is one of the major agglomerations in Europe or even in the world. Over the last 25 years, our capital seriously improved its role, strengthened its role as the cultural capital. And today, Moscow, the Moscow agglomeration, is home to more than 20 million people, and this accounts for 13% of the whole Russian population, and the contribution to the GDP is 2 times more than the population of this agglomeration. So it means that Moscow is an economic donor for the whole country, and not vice versa, as sometimes is believed. Moscow is surrounded by a lot of stereotypes or even myths, and I would like to dissipate some of them. For instance, it is commonly believed that in Moscow we don't have any real production, real manufacturing, and this is not true. Around Moscow we have a very modern, diversified economy, which is typical of the best world agglomerations. We have such innovative industries as insurance, healthcare, IT technologies, and also the manufacturing sector and high-tech production plays a great role there too. Contrary to the stereotypes, the budget of Moscow is not dependent on the oil and gas industry. The share of the gas and oil revenues reduced from 17 to 3%. And Moscow, step by step, becomes the center for high-tech experts. Moscow hosts more than 500 companies which export high-tech products for processing industry. It is home to a lot of labs and research centers. The total volume of exports in 2016 amounted to 520 billion Russian rubles, or 20% of total Russian high-tech exports. Moscow, despite the crisis, continues to attract investments. And the investments to the city increase for 6 years in a row and now amount to 1,700 billion rubles, and the bulk of them are private investments. It is believed that Moscow and the Moscow agglomeration collects and kind of attracts all the talents and skilled professionals from other cities of Russia. This is not true, really. We have surplus of jobs, about 2 million jobs, but mainly this surplus, these vacancies are filled by those who live in the vicinity of Moscow. But at the same time, Moscow creates about 3.5 million jobs around Russia. Moscow consumes 70% of goods and services produced in other regions of our country. The geographical scope of creating such jobs ranges from Vladivostok to northwestern part of Russia. In the northwest, for instance, Moscow creates 1.4 million jobs. And if we look at Moscow, we may understand how agglomerations may contribute to the development of the country, thanks to the concentration of the investments, creating jobs, setting up a high-tech and diversified economy with huge productivity. The internal or domestic regional product grew at a high pace, and therefore Moscow and other agglomerations will drive the Russian economy in future. It is believed that, and sometimes in our kitchen talks we may hear that Moscow consumes the whole budget of Russia, that it takes all the resources and leaves nothing for other regions, and this is total nonsense, because Moscow is the biggest donor of the Russian budget, and through the Russian budget, federal budget, it redistributes the sources among other regions. Moscow contributed to the federal budget more than 1 trillion rubles, or 60% more than in the previous years, and the actually all other regions taken together actually take about 1.5 trillion Russian rubles, and most of this money is due to the revenues from the companies which are operational in Moscow. The modern legislation is regulated the way that the profit tax is distributed evenly, proceeding from the number of people employed and the economic contribution of the companies and enterprises in certain regions. And there is even more illustrative figure. The contributions to the federal funds and budgets. And for instance, if we look at the pension fund and the medical insurance fund, we see certain growth which took place recently in terms of the contributions from Muscovites, Moscow residents, and these contributions to those funds increased almost 4 times. Every 10 Russian citizens get their pensions and get their medical insurance from the Moscow budget, from the revenues collected in terms of taxes paid by the Moscow residents. And these tendencies actually could have looked differently. I mean, the insurance contributions and other contributions, they, for instance, in other cases could, instead of growing, be falling. The improvement in those spheres is related to the talented and professional work of the Muscovites and certain measures which were adopted. Success of the city is dependent on the advanced development of the engineering, utilities, and transport infrastructure. If we fail to do that, then the main advantage of the big city, the being home to a lot of people, will just result in congestion, and therefore the megacity will become a source of problems rather than the solution to problems. That's why trillions of dollars around the world are invested into the development of the transport infrastructure, first and foremost. Proceeding from the rationale of the comprehensive development, we are developing public transportation. We build metro stations, suburban communication, commuter trains. We are building the Moscow Transport Ring Road, the big underground ring road, main metro. We are building about 100 kilometers of roads a year and about 10 metro stations a year. And these are roads not just a greenfield project, but this is a very sophisticated engineering infrastructural project implemented in the midst of the municipal or urban life, and which actually is laid at the crossroad of the commercial and housing buildings. In terms of housing, we have to renovate the post-industrial areas and build affordable housing. And for instance, if you drive along the central streets of the city, they look very well, but if we go high up above the city, we'll see a lot of depressive post-industrial areas, which for many years were neglected, and they actually got dilapidated rather than got renovated or developed. And a certain strategy was adopted in terms of those territories, and the commissioning of housing, commissioning for offices and commercial venues. This was done at the post-industrial areas. I may illustrate that by the construction of a new city on the territory of ZIL, the former car manufacturing plant. In order to be a comfortable and convenient city, Moscow should provide the modern conditions, yards, clean air, certain festivities. We have to renovate and restore monuments. Museums and theaters have to be focused on. This is not just a luxury, but rather this is a strategy and the ambition which is necessary in order to develop the urban environment. As a result of the last years, we managed to landscape 450 parks, and this year we're going to landscape and reconstruct over 300 different streets, including the historical ones. The urban air is less polluted by 10%, and there are a lot of festivities hosted by the city. At the same time, contrary to the habitual stereotype, when we do the reconstruction of the streets, the throughput capacity is not diminishing. As a rule, the throughput capacity would only increase. One of the main problems of all the modern cities, and Moscow is not an exception, is the aging housing stock. And in Moscow, we have a lot of old buildings dated back to Nikita Khrushchev times. These buildings are now in the emergency situation and very dilapidated. Moscow has accumulated a huge experience of renovating the 5-story buildings of Khrushchev times, 1960s. And this year, the State Duma adopted a law about the renovation of housing in Moscow, and therefore now we may tackle with this problem consistently without waiting until those buildings collapse. And certainly we have to build modern districts for the residents of those houses. The new buildings have to be modern, convenient, and comfortable. For the designing, we invite the best architects of the country, and we even host international contests. Russia has launched the program aimed at developing smaller cities, the rural territories, and there is a program aimed at developing the Far East. Unfortunately, there is no program aimed at developing agglomerations and megacities. But still, over the last years, we have realized that we have to deal with the cities and agglomerations targetedly, to focus on them, to develop the transport communication between the major cities. Mr. Putin said that our cities have to look into the future, and that's why when we develop their development strategy, we have to take into consideration the most state-of-the-art urban philosophy. Our citizens are the main competitive edge. Moscow has all the necessary for the dynamic growth in future we have certain historical experience, we have certain traditions for innovations to be backed. We have a lot of skilled and talented citizens, residents, people who come to Moscow from all over the world and from all over the country, and I'm sure that Moscow will become a reliable partner and a very serious competitor for many world cities. Thank you so much.
Сергей Семенович, не уходите, пожалуйста, со сцены. Сергей Семенович.
Mr. Sobyanin, could you please stay on the stage? We don't want you to go. We're about to start our panel discussion. So I would ask all the participants of our panel discussion to come to the stage. And while they're coming up, I would like to ask you a question. Mr. Sobyanin, Moscow's experience is quite unique in Russia. What is happening in Moscow does not just inspire Muscovites, it also sets a role model for other major cities in Russia as well. So my question to you is, as the mayor of Moscow, how would you say Moscow could help other major cities to catch up? And how can you share your best practices with other cities that don't have such opportunities as you do in Moscow? Well, the best way to help is not to interfere with other people's affairs. That's number one. Number two, like I said, there are two ways to help, two ways Moscow can help. Number one, we can take half of Moscow's resources and give it to other cities, and then you might say you have addressed this issue. But actually, this is a road to nowhere. This way you will destroy Moscow's economy, and other cities will not benefit from this undertaking. You saw what happened over the past 6 to 7 years. We've increased the amount of funds we transfer from Moscow to the federal budget. It doubled, it tripled, and let's say if Moscow's economy is left without possibilities for growth, this means there will be no fixed investment from private companies, and we would be left where we were 6 or 7 years ago. We would all lose Moscow, provinces, the entire country. So, for the country to develop well, for other regions to develop well, all cities should be able to move forward, including Moscow. We should not stop Moscow's development. What about best practice? I'm not talking about money. What about best practices? Well, best practices, of course, we live in an open world today. Moscow is an open city, and the forum that we host here today is another good opportunity for us to share our best practices with our colleagues from other big cities in Russia. And actually, I know quite a few big cities in Russia who are learning from Moscow. And Moscow is also always willing to learn from other cities as well. Thank you. Thank you, Mikhail. Thank you, Sergey. So, dear panelists, we will now ask you to say a few words. And first, I would like to ask Gerard Mestrallet, the chairman of a global energy company, ENG. Mr. Mestrallet, mega cities and agglomerations, it's not just a success story, it's not just their contribution to the economy, but also many big problems. We know from Russia's experience that it is the biggest cities that have serious problems regarding environment. And this is an objective fact because you have a high concentration of population in these cities. A lot of economic activities going on. And I know your company does not just think about generating energy, but also about efficient ways to generate energy. And big cities with their carbon footprint also offer opportunities to increase energy efficiency. For example, you can use the density of population in those areas as a positive factor. Could you please share your company's experience in this area?
Mr. Mayor, ladies and gentlemen, that's a real pleasure for me to be here once again in the city of Moscow that I like so much. First of all, I would like to congratulate the mayor and the municipality for the extraordinary transformation of Moscow, which is now taking its place at one of the greatest capitals in the world. It's true that cities and business and energy companies are complementary and have a role to play to improve the quality of life in the cities. The cities are looking for new solutions for their infrastructures, mobility, energy, water, connectivity, education, healthcare. And a company like ours can really help. ENGIE, it's a $70 billion company in power, gas, energy services, and present in 70 countries. The domain where we are living is really impacted by what I would say 4 dramatic revolutions. The first one is technological. We have new technology, wind, PV, photovoltaic, micro heat pumps, micro cogeneration. All those technologies dedicated to energy are CO2 free, but they are smaller and smaller in size, and therefore they can be closer to the customer, closer to the territories, and closer to the cities, and that is very important for the big cities. The second revolution is, of course, digital. That's the truth for us, like for any sector, with the smart grids, sensors, Internet of Things, big data, artificial intelligence, which is very important for the energy efficiency. And energy efficiency, we have 100,000 people dedicated to energy efficiency, and this allows to improve the quality of the air, to reduce the exposure to carbon footprint. That's key for the cities. The third revolution is cultural, with the change in the head of the people. Are the people essentially urban population, because they want now to know where does electricity comes from, renewables or nuclear or coal. They don't want coal no longer. And sustainability and climate change is now a priority for everyone. And the fourth revolution is urban. I would like to add just a few additional figures to those given by Dominique and the mayor. Cities cover 2% of the surface, but they house more than 50% of the world population. They consume 75% of the world energy and are responsible for 80% of the greenhouse gas emissions. So it's absolutely necessary to impact and change these last factors. And so in our sector, we have smaller and smaller units, so decentralization is on the way, and there's a shift of decision power from states to big municipalities. And so a group like ours is changing its business model. We are no longer a commodity provider, gas, power, water. We become the partner of our customers, and our business becomes more local. And so in order to help cities, I would like to give briefly some examples. Paris. In Paris, we own and operate district heating, district cooling, the largest in the world, but also a camera network to to help to manage traffic and improve the street safety. In Singapore, with our partner, we are developing the first IoT wireless network. In Rotterdam, we improve air quality by developing 4,000 charging stations. In Arlington, in Texas, we are transforming the street lights with more than 10,000 LED. In Lancashire, in UK, we achieve social and economic regeneration of some places, urban buildings, by outsourcing and improving the city services. And two last examples. We won a very competitive tender in Ohio University in order to reduce the carbon footprint and reduce the energy consumption of 500 buildings of the Ohio State University. It's a $1.2 billion tender. And recently we became, by an acquisition in UAE, in the Middle East, the leading provider of urban district cooling systems. Everywhere we work with municipalities, there is a complementarity between cities and companies. We intend to become the partner of the big city with some key factors: long-term relationship, greater energy efficiency, real environmental benefits, like clean air, for example. So becoming the long-term partner of cities and territories here is our objective today. And we respect the philosophy of the public-private partnership. It's very simple. We propose, the municipality decides, and we deliver. Thank you.
Большое спасибо, господин.
Thank you, Mr. Mestrallet. Right now, I would like to turn to Mr. Hazem Galal, representing PricewaterhouseCoopers. He is a partner and the global leader of PwC's cities and local government sector. Actually, when we started our session, and you may remember me mentioning that PwC analyzed efficiency indicators for major agglomerations, and they have their ranking system, and Moscow looks quite good in their ranking system, so I hope Hazem will mention this.
Спасибо, Mikhail.
Thank you, Mikhail.
To the Moscow urban.
Сказать, что
The first time that I came here to the inaugural edition of the Moscow Urban Forum, we were focusing on cities. And we realized everybody's seen the numbers, everybody has seen the statistics with urbanization. But if we were to only look at cities in isolation from the regions that they are in, we're missing a little bit of the picture. So we decided that despite the challenge of getting data accurate on the level of agglomerations, that we were going to start looking and researching agglomerations to answer three main questions. First of all, is it really the case that agglomerations are different from the rest of the national context in a country? The second most important question was, what would be the impact of agglomerations, positive and negative? And then, most importantly, how to mitigate some of the negative effects and also how to benefit from some of the positive ones. So we just finished this research. We're launching here today with you. And in order to do this, we started looking at some factors with respect to socioeconomic development and to start comparing how do agglomerations, the largest ones in a given country, compare to the national level. Yeah, so you see here 13 elements that we looked at. And it turns out that, you know, in most of the variables with respect to quality of life, level of education, economic productivity, the main agglomeration in a country really outpaces the rest of the nation. However, when you think about the two ones that are on the bottom there on the left-hand side, which are the Gini coefficient, a measure of inequality in a given society, and also unemployment, we have higher levels in agglomeration. So it became very important to us to learn from this and to think about what is it that we can do to mitigate some of these effects. And then on the right-hand side, you see the 20 different agglomerations, the largest one in the world, and the degree to which actually the national sort of like performance is outpaced by this specific agglomeration. And you see Moscow here is in second place after Beijing. What that means is that when you look at all the 13 variables, Moscow really outpaces the rest of Russia on all of 11 out of them. And Düsseldorf in the bottom is the least basically influential in Germany by comparison. Additionally, when you think about developed and developing nations and agglomerations, in the first video introduction and then in Dominic's presentation, we've seen that the majority of these agglomerations and urbanization is happening in developing cities, developing regions, developing countries. So here we see basically that the Moscow agglomeration is at the top in terms of its performance of all the developing agglomerations, which is good news in terms of how actually it's positioned, but we know that Moscow and Russia's ambitions are to be really competing with the top group, which is currently dominated by New York. And at the very right-hand side of Moscow, you would see that the last variable we have there is the level of influence on the country's economy. And it's number one in the list of 10 agglomerations that we looked at in terms of the influence on the country as a whole. This is a very interesting map, and in continuation to some of the comments that His Excellency the Mayor Subanian was given earlier in terms of the Moscow contribution to the national budget, there are additional impacts on the other regions as well. So you see here, for example, that in terms of imports, about $39 billion are imported by the Moscow agglomeration from other regions, which actually translates to 3.5 million jobs created in the other regions. So there is a very important impact for the Moscow agglomeration as a driver also of economy and economic activities in other regions. Now, as you look at this map as well, and Russia is one of the most continentally extended countries over multiple time zones, the other visual impact of this is the Russian Federation really needs another agglomeration in the east to drive basically a similar impact to what Moscow's doing, you know, for the western part of Russia, if you will. So, you know, how can you replicate a similar impact positively that Moscow's having on the western part of Russia? We've also looked at the type of activities that take place in agglomerations. In addition, you know, to business, financial services, which are always usually activities that we see in these type of agglomerations as they attract top talent, not only on the national level, but also globally. We've also looked at the creative economy. And we've seen that these high value-added subsectors of the economy and the creative economy tend to grow at a much higher level in these agglomerations. I'll give you some statistics. For example, in the Moscow agglomeration, the creative sector growth rate has been on average of 22% a year, which is 1.7 times higher than any of the other sectors. The digital economy in Moscow from 2010 to 2015 grew by over 210%. So you see all of these positive effects that agglomerations have in terms of attracting top talent that works in these high value-added sectors like the creative economy and digital knowledge-based type subsectors. In terms also of this is the creative economy. I think we're moving in the right direction here. In terms of also the high concentration of resources in agglomeration, this creates ideal conditions, business conditions, and usually, again, to repeat, that is not a given in all agglomerations. That is pretty much driven by leadership, driven by regulatory frameworks, driven by a vision within the agglomeration to create these positive conditions that will really provide a stimulus for all the creativeness and all the density and friction of knowledge to yield positive economic growth. And on the right-hand side here of this analysis, you would see here that also in terms of the number, for example, of enterprises per 1,000 people, in Moscow, it is one of the highest in the 10 agglomerations we looked at. It's almost 6 times the national level. So again, very positive impact for when you get the right conditions in place in an agglomeration. However, it's not all positive news, because sometimes when an agglomeration gets too big, we start having negative externalities. For example, in terms of mobility, if the agglomeration is designed in a way that everybody from outside the periphery areas moves into the center in one CBD, that creates long commute time, that creates also a reduction in productivity and so forth. So then it becomes very important for us when we're looking at existing agglomerations to see really where are the centers of activity, to create polycentric environments that would actually reduce commute times, improve the quality of life for the residents within a commute. When you think, for example, an agglomeration like Grand Sao Paulo, the way it works right now, everybody comes from the periphery of the city to almost one concentrated area, and that results in a lot of loss of productivity. These are some of the negative effects that we have to mitigate as we are actually thinking about some of the design conditions, and some of the urban regeneration projects that are happening in Moscow here are good examples of doing that to create new centers of activity. Conscious of time, and the full results of the survey and the analysis will be available. In conclusion, we really need to think about basically how do we create areas of influence through well-performing agglomerations at the national level. We spoke about what's happening in the east of the Russian Federation. The development of the right conditions within agglomerations, leadership, public sector, private partnerships, regulations, and sometimes the coordination mechanisms within an agglomeration are not necessarily always aligned with the administrative type divisions that we have. So how do you create that coordination within an agglomeration in mobility, in economic diversification, and so forth? Also, the implementation of a portfolio approach to the development of different sectors. During the financial crisis, Singapore's economy, because they have some manufacturing, was able to recover much faster than Hong Kong, which purely depended on financial services. And then last but not least, basically, the polycentric approach in order to create jobs and economic activities in multiple parts of the agglomeration so that we can avoid some of the negative impacts. Thank you very much.
Большое спасибо, Хазе.
Thank you so much, Jose. And now I'd like to proceed to another question related to the development of agglomerations. If agglomerations are seen as the main driver for economic growth in the country, every driver, every engine needs gasoline, and for agglomerations, this is mainly money. This is one of the topics where the Russian agglomerations do not look very well against its international peers. I have a question to Mr. Kostin, who is president of VTB Bank, one of the main banks of Russia. I have the following question. Many financial products which are critically important for the development of agglomerations run into certain problems and do not develop well, and we cannot even understand what these problems are about. VTB Bank focuses a lot on the development and issues a lot of products which are important for agglomerations. For instance, public-private partnership investments. And 3 or 4 years ago, another initiative was proposed together with the mortgage lending agency. VTB suggests to develop standardized rented housing, which is crucial for the development of the second stage of agglomerations. But there are certain problems which are typical not only of the cities, but rather of the regions too, the access to the funds. And I'd like to ask this question to you. Specifically, infrastructural projects. In many developed and advanced nations, at the stage of the construction, the banks are providing money, and securitization actually takes place a bit later at the stage of the commissioning. In Russia, not always the banks are extending loans at the stage of the construction. As a result, project managers have to issue securities at early stages of the project. And this creates extra difficulties and problems in terms of funding, and increases the cost of access to the funds. Rented flats. Could you briefly tell us about this promising direction of your development? And for instance, will this joint project of VTB and mortgage lending agency include the issue of securitization of future proceeds from rental? And, for instance, securitization of proceeds from the issue of securities. Another question. Agglomerations are very specific urban organizations, and Mr. Galal, for instance, quoted one of the examples in terms of number of enterprises per 1,000 people. Moscow is outpacing Paris and New York. And in Moscow, we can find not necessarily small-size enterprises, but rather medium-sized enterprises, which are developing in the area of services. And they promote mostly light asset model. They don't have a lot of movable assets and are the tangible assets or fixed assets, which could be used as collateral. How do you extend loans to such enterprises, to medium-sized enterprises? In Russia, such companies have no access to the funds because they cannot afford securitization. Does VTB have any ideas how to help them? Thank you so much, Michael. And still, I got prepared for that. And before, I would like to show some video clip which covers the main milestones of our activity, and afterwards I would like to answer your questions, so please show the video clip. The creation of a comfortable city environment is a kind of a polyphony in music. The ideas of architects, municipal authorities, investors, and financial partners are to be melting to compose a new melody for the city. Today, the Russian capital is a dynamic metropolis. VTB Group has partnered with government of the city of Moscow to help make the city a comfortable place for living. Over the past 6 years, 5,700,000 square meters of high-quality modern residential space has been built, reconstructed, and launched in the construction stage with the financial participation of VTB Group. One of the most important areas in the activity of the Moscow city government is reorganization of former industrial zones. New comfortable city districts are being constructed in their place, housing and social public structures along with community areas and parks. VTB is providing support for 18 of such projects under a comprehensive program for renovation of industrial areas. Their total area is 242 hectares. Constructing new buildings and housing cities in already established districts is an equally significant challenge for a modern city. VTB has provided financing for a range of such projects which successfully blend with the existing historical and architectural context. Our series of city construction objectives, which were supported by the bank, is connected with Moscow's renovated, well-known architectural dominance. The legendary Central Detsky magazine or Central Children's Store in Lubyanka Square is the largest department store in its kind in Europe. Reconstruction of another symbolic site. The Dynamo Stadium demonstrates another important trend in modern urbanism, creation and development of theme-based clusters connected with sports, art, ecology, and the history of Moscow. The heart of this new territory will be a unique complex combining the stadium and universal arena for sports and other leisure events. Dynamo will go through a rebirth period and still preserve the spirit of this legendary club. With the support of VTB, it will be possible to restore and recreate unique bas relief that have a major historical and cultural value. The VTB Ice Palace, the largest of its kind in Russia, will become one of the central elements of the Legend Park City cluster. The world-class Dream Island amusement park in Negatinsky Poima will be completed in 2 years. This will be the first indoor theme park in Russia. VTB Bank will provide the majority of the bulk of the financing. One of the priorities of a modern city, megacity, is development of a leisure infrastructure in established residential city quarters. A major step in this direction will be made by refurbishing of cinema theaters that were built in 60s and 90s of the past century into family cultural centers. With VTB support, 39 districts of Moscow will reconstruct old buildings to house multiplex cinema theaters, leisure educational centers, cafes and shops. High-quality modern transport infrastructure is the key component of a comfortable city environment. A lot of evident changes have taken place in this area in recent years. VTB Bank actively lends for reconstruction of new Moscow metro lines, stations, along with major projects for reconstruction and development of Moscow's streets and road network. Bicycles are becoming an inseparable part of Moscow's city culture. The city's Velibike bicycle rental network is the largest scale project which VTB is implemented together with the Moscow government. It is difficult to imagine the capital's transport system without innovative banking products that are integrated with the city environment, including such products as the Super Troika debit card. It combines the functionality of a plastic card and the familiar Troika transport application. VTB is acting as a partner of Moscow city government in developing the Moscowite social card program. More than 4 million cards have been already issued under this program, and new cards are issued on the basis of the Mir payment system. Airports, bridges, new highways and transport junctions have been built in different Russian regions with VTB Bank's support, including projects in the format of concessions and public-private partnership. We see a promising outlook for using this mechanism in future high-scale infrastructural projects. Moscow is changing rapidly. VTB Group is happy to be part of these changes. We are ready to achieve new major-scale goals in partnership with the Moscow city government. Thank you.
Я всю жизнь прожил в Москве.
Thank you. I lived in Moscow all my life, and I spent, for the most part of my life, I thought that urban development, at least according to city authorities, is building standard, housing, and fixing problems, fixing potholes when the road becomes impassable. But over the past 5 to 7 years, I've noticed that actually this is a highly complex and smart science about making life in our city comfortable. Good for living, for work, and for recreation. So I believe that Moscow is really a role model today. And if you look at this forum, even that tells you that the Moscow authorities and our mayor have turned Moscow into an advanced center in urban development. You know, we have a subsidiary in London, and a guy who works for us there in London sent me a picture of Buckingham Palace. You know, across from Queen Victoria monument, they started changing, laying new concrete. I think Sadiq Khan, the mayor of London, looked at what you're doing in Moscow and decided to change their pavement there as well after he learned what you're doing here in Moscow with Moscow streets. You know, now I would like to respond to questions from Mikhail. We bankers used to think that a bank in a city is about having as many offices as possible, as many ATMs as possible. Everything should be nice. But today our concept has changed drastically. We use cutting-edge technology. We want to make it easier for Muscovites to make payments. all kinds of transactions, paying utility bills, whatever. We want to make all those services as convenient for them as possible. Government services, social functions. We're taking all these things to a whole new level today technologically, and we work closely with the city authorities in Moscow, with the Moscow companies, with the Moscow Metro company. And within the next 2 years, we'll see a revolution in this area. We'll see new systems emerging that will work on a wholly different level, will provide a wholly new level of comfort for Muscovites. And the second issue you mentioned is working with businesses. This is also necessary. And we do work a lot, again, together with the Moscow government, to provide certain securities for bank. Of course, you always have risks in banking, but in order to be able to address, we need to help SMEs in resolving their issues today. Okay, as far as social housing is concerned, we all remember what Dostoevsky said about social housing, but we are actually working closely with the mortgage agency. We've signed an agreement, and they've subsidized 85,000 square meters of rentals. We have 2 locations, Match Point at Kutuzovsky Prospect, and we have Symbol, another location. These are compact and inexpensive projects. We'll launch these 2 places in 2018, 2019. This is an accomplished project, you might say. It's in full swing right now. And in addition to that, we have another project, the Heart of the Capital. Again, will provide social housing. This is really important for Muscovites because not everybody can afford to buy a new apartment, but renting an apartment is something that people really need today, and the city needs this for development. So, of course, our bank really cares about what is happening in the city today. We have projects like the children's store at Lubyanka, the best store for children in Europe, actually worldwide, I would say. And there are a few other projects as well. I would like to mention some of them. Recently, we launched a big project at Presnya. We're building residential quarters there. And there is a building there, 6,000 square meters, that belongs to the best tradition of constructivism. It was built in 1931. It's Zotov Bakery. So initial plan was to commercialize this building, but then Marina Lashak came to me. This is the director of the Pushkin Museum, and she asked if the museum could have it. They wanted to turn this building into a modern art museum because Moscow does need a modern art museum, and our leading museums need to purchase more art. So we have agreed to make it our joint project. This will be a museum and a gallery that will exhibit the best pieces of modern art, Russian and international. So within the next year or 2, we will implement this project. I think that business should have projects like this. Actually, you asked me whether we finance this kind of starting projects. So let me give you another example. You saw this entertainment center in our video. We funded 85% of that. This is a very good example of project financing. We assumed most of the risks in this project, and since Mr. Sobyanin said that this project is really important for the city, we will definitely do that. We will definitely do that for our children. In conclusion, I would like to say, you may remember this play, Chekhov's play, Three Sisters, and one of the sisters say, you never notice weather when you live in Moscow. And you know what is happening with the weather today in Moscow. But if we do all the things that we talk about today, Moscow really will become a city where people don't notice weather. They don't care about the weather. They're so happy that they don't care about the weather surprises. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Kostin. In conclusion of our discussion today, I would like to raise another subject. Agglomerations worldwide are at the forefront of development. They grow fast. And this means that for society, for people who live in agglomerations, who are affected by agglomerations, can sometimes face unpredictable stress and tension. This is what happened in the 19th century, this was the situation in the 20th century, and this is also happening today. But possibly the problems that people face in fast-growing cities today are not the same as what people had in the 19th century, in the 20th century. There is modern technology, there are telecommunications. This changes the entire structure of social interaction. So my next question is for Parag Khanna, professor at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Governance, who also specializes in big cities. What are the modern challenges that cities face today due to the fact that modern agglomerations have to grow in this situation of technological revolution?
Thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here, and I just want to say again what an honor it has been to spend yesterday and today here and to be able to learn so much from the mayor, the vice mayors, and all of you. I think we should remember not to underestimate what a time of upheaval we live in right now in areas that affect Russia, such as geopolitics, what is happening in energy markets, and against that backdrop, against those challenges, it is truly amazing, to echo what Dominic also said, to witness Moscow's evolution in really becoming a city which, unlike many other megacities, is showing marked signs of improvement and innovation and moving forward, because the challenging circumstances of the world today make that more difficult than ever. So Moscow is really to be commended for what it has achieved and continues to. And so let me talk about some of these challenges. I'll give really 5 points in terms of the areas that I see really in common that Moscow faces with other cities, and what is being done right. The first is what we would call supply-led growth, which in orthodox economics is a bad thing. But when we look at the success stories, places like Shanghai, Singapore, Dubai, what they have been doing is anticipating demand. They have realized that they will continue to grow, that citizens and migrants will continue to come, that the demand for housing and for other needs like transportation, in particular housing and transportation, have been very big themes here yesterday and today. So anticipating that demand and leading with sufficient supply, even if you're catching up, but getting ahead and anticipating through the data and the spatial planning and analysis such as you are doing is extremely important. So that would be number one. And just to echo Hazem's point, actually, about becoming polycentric, realizing that a mega-city agglomeration is a different kind of city. Many cities can be complacent about having just one urban center, but not a megacity, not an agglomeration. An agglomeration must think ahead about having 3 or 4 or 5 significant centers, perhaps with different niches or roles, and that too I see Moscow is doing. So supply-led growth and anticipation is number one. Number two is the administrative coordination between the federal and the city levels. Here we have talked about some of the critical issues like sustainability, immigration. These are very often federal policies, energy policy, stimulating a clean energy or sustainable energy transformation through subsidies. These are federal, national matters, but the city plays a very important role as the test bed for those. So we need to have that administrative alignment between the federal and the city level on these critical issues where the city's voice is extremely important because the city is most affected by those policies. Number three is the fiscal devolution. And for those who heard Mayor Ken Livingstone yesterday, the former mayor of London, he was brilliant on this subject of devolution. The fact that cities must have the authorities, political as well as fiscal, to tackle the challenges. And cities have to, those that don't have those resources on their own, through their internal economic dynamism and size and scale, the way that Moscow does have, those cities have to be given the means or empowered to have the means to have fiscal resources. And he contrasts what he sees in Moscow with what is happening across the United Kingdom today as a very sharp contrast. But again, as the largest country in the world with numerous cities and the desire to create more hubs around the country, that devolution of resources and empowering second-tier cities is extremely important. So number 3 is devolution. Number 4 is what I like to call the economic master planning. You know, clearly today one can hire the best Russian or foreign architects to design the districts and the new developments of the future. But that is the physical master planning. The economic master planning is far, far more complex. That requires an understanding of the many different vectors and variables in the world economy. What sectors and industries are growing? What can be Russia's or Moscow's role in the emerging division of labor in the world economy? Again, anticipating forward the changes in some of the technologies that Dominic mentioned, automation, Internet of Things. How is it that a society is prepared for that? How does it not just build accordingly, but plan its economy accordingly? And that requires a degree of coordination between the public sector, industries, companies, universities, thinking 5 to 10 years ahead. What are you training students for? What are the companies going to hire them to do? What are the global markets that they're going to serve? What are the domestic needs? It's extremely complex, this economic master planning. And the more that is at stake in our cities, the more we have to be obsessively doing this economic master planning, not every 5 years or 10 years, but literally every single minute. This is survival. This is planning for your economic future as a city. So economic master planning. And the final point is the connectivity, the international connectivity. Moscow is getting better and better connected through airline transportation, through the investments in Russian railways, thinking about the partnerships between Moscow and other cities economically, financially, in terms of talent flows, investment. That is something that every city must do too, because as I was showing yesterday with these maps, it's very difficult to isolate the purely domestic value of the economy of a city. So much does depend on connectivity. And when you do map out those connections, what you realize is you can do even more. Every city can be more connected, and that will increase its value, increase its role. And I'll just end on a humorous note, perhaps, but today I noticed that the Silk Rally is going to launch, that these rugged trucks are going to take off from Red Square and drive all the way across Russia and Kazakhstan to Xi'an in China. This is, of course, one way to celebrate or to inaugurate some of these Belt and Road Initiative projects. And what is so interesting about the way we perceive Moscow when we are studying and analyzing it is that, yes, it is true that Moscow is the largest city in Europe, and we think of it as a European city. But really, Moscow's future is to be the largest city on the central Silk Road, really connecting Western Europe with the Far East. That is the true future of Moscow, to be the largest city in the midway point of this world's greatest mega continent. So connectivity would be the 5th principle, and I am, again, very, very pleased to see how well Moscow is working so hard in all of these domains. So congratulations and thank you.
Большое спасибо, Parag.
Thank you very much, Parag. We will now conclude our discussion, and in conclusion, I would like to ask our speakers, Dominic and Sergei Sobyanin, to give us an overview. Dominic, so any comments you would like to make in conclusion of our session today? But I would like to add another question for you. In the last few years, as a result of two waves of the global economic crisis, we saw a growing tendency of deglobalization, and we see the role of global trade decreasing in development. Parag just said that global cities oppose this trend, and because of connectivity. They're not just connected within the city, but they're also connected to other growth centers in the country and around the world. So do you think mega cities in the world and in Russia can turn around this trend, the reduction of global economic integration?
First of all, I said I've been taking a lot of notes, learning a lot, and I agree with all the points that are being said about the need for innovation, the role that an agglomeration plays in its region, the importance of the cultural side that was mentioned, that these are all critical. But maybe just to get to your question, because the connectivity point that Parag talked about, I completely agree with. While the world may seem to be becoming less globalized, it's not a popular thing to talk about. I don't see many multinational companies saying they're global. They say they have their local leadership, and their commitment is more important than the global side. But I do think cities play an absolutely critical role, and you see much more connectedness between cities. I would argue that there is much more connection, for example, between San Francisco and Shanghai and Shenzhen than anything at the at the sort of Washington, Beijing level. If you go to Chicago and see Rahm Emanuel, he says, "Welcome to the 30th largest country on earth." That's how he sees his city as a country in what he's doing, and wants to build relationships with other cities that are moving around. I think the innovation links that are going on are extremely important. And when I think about, again, Moscow and some of the areas, I think we're very fortunate here, because you've got a significant city with talent, is the way I would look at it, sitting in a country with an incredible amount of resources. When I think about we're going to need energy. We're going to need food is going to be a massive industry in the future, but the technology required is significant to be able to make it work properly. Healthcare, I mentioned before, being a significant issue. So you've got a country with the resources and the talent, and you have the city that can actually make that work. And I think we're going to see much more connections between the Moscows and the Beijings, and the Moscows and the Chicagos, and the Moscows and the New Yorks, and the Moscows and the Londons, than we are going to see it. If I just take the UK with Brexit, you have a country that voted in a particular way. If it was London that voted, it would have been a very different outcome. That says something about what's happening in that area. It's like a city-state. So like Parag, I think we may want to look back in history and look at the Hanseatic League, at those cities, Venice. If you think about Hamburg, all the way, and how they connected, that may be more of the future than what we're seeing today in terms of countries. Cities connecting with cities, mayors connecting with mayors, maybe a parliament of mayors at some point in our future.
Looks really a little bit like Hansa Union. Спасибо большое, Доминик.
Thank you very much, Dominic. Mr. Sobyanin, once again, I would be grateful if you make any comments to conclude our discussion, but I also have a very specific question for you. In your speech, you spoke a lot about Moscow and its achievements, and I really adore Moscow's policies on agglomeration, but I have a question for you. What do you think are the most serious challenges and unsolved problems that will determine the future development of Moscow? at the next stage, maybe in the next 10 to 15 years, something that you failed to accomplish while you were the mayor of Moscow?
First of all, I'd like to thank all our colleagues for active discussion of the problems and issues at hand, especially the ones related to Moscow. Thank you for appreciating the Moscow achievements, your appreciation of the Moscow residents and everyone who makes this city a modern one. Speaking a little bit about this Hansa Union. Certainly, we should not actually get back to the medieval disintegration of the cities rather than the Hansa Union. I do think that the nation-states should develop together and agglomeration should go hand in hand with the regions. This is a more important trend, especially if we speak about the relations between the cities. And the city's development should somehow match the development of the regions of the rest of the country. Otherwise, there would be dramatic deterioration of the security and other spheres. And we should remember that there are now great cities without great countries. This is number one. And number two is that the challenges which we have mentioned and the challenges which we are facing now, we're going to face in future. This is what Mr. Hanna used to say when he mentioned the polycentric development of the agglomerations. In my presentation, I said that actually we now have improved the housing issue in the cities, whereas in Moscow, actually, progress was not huge. It means that most of the affordable housing were built in the outskirts or even beyond the city limits, and therefore we have major flows of commuters who come to Moscow to work and then go back, and this seriously influenced or even affected the environment, the transport, and congestion and housing are two major challenges for the city. On the one hand, we have to build more houses, and at the same time, we have to create new jobs. That's why in the median part of Moscow, where most of the industrial parks and industrial sites are located, in our master plan, from the very beginning, we actually designed for a high density of the industrial construction. Any owner of an industrial site or territory may design on his own new industries and enterprises with the density of about 15,000 square meters per 1 hectare. So we open the gates for renovation of the industrial territories. So it means that not only we are building housings and housing facilities, but we also promote the polycentric approach. The same is true of the new territory which acceded to Moscow. There is a global challenge for all the cities. That's the environment, and our colleagues spoke about that. The rapid development of transport certainly affects the environment. 90% of the environmental problems is about vehicles and transport. We have to reduce congestion. We have to focus on the development of the public means of transportation, and probably not just only public means of transportation, but there should be more electrically driven vehicles, and this, despite the enlargement of the megacities, would not deteriorate the environment, and step by step the environment improves. And we have to keep up with those rates, and we have even moved in an advanced pace. And the third thing is about the retaining of the historical look of the city. There are a lot of large-scale infrastructural projects implemented at the city, but we should not be forgetful about the history of the city. Renovation at the same time retaining its historical look of the cities. This is our top priority. First of all, what we do, we are reconstructing the old facades. We somehow disclose the city, help people discover its regional view. We have restored 700 different monuments this year. This is an unprecedented feat for Moscow, and still there is more room for improvement. And another challenge, an important one, is how to coordinate the development of Moscow and the regions which cooperate with us. Sadly, we made some progress there. We have set up the Council for the Transport Development. And therefore we connect not only Moscow and Moscow region, but also we connect Moscow to other gravity centers from around the world. Moscow acts as a bridge between Asia and Europe. All those challenges, all those problems would be the main ones in the light of the future development of the city. I'd like to extend my gratitude for my colleagues for the deep dive analysis, for the professional conversation which we're conducting here at the Urban Forum. Thank you so much. Thank you, Mr. Sobyanin. We have to finish our first plenary session, but the discussion is not over yet. In several minutes, our discussion will be followed in London conference hall, and we're going to speak about agglomerations and how it may affect the strategy for Russia's development. Thank you, dear panelists. Thank you, dear speakers.